A landmark trial is underway that will help untangle the web of legal liability in the opioid crisis. It's the first federal opioid trial happening in Ohio, and we've got an attorney who's been following this saga for quite a while. Austin Pennington is a trial attorney who handles a wide variety of criminal and civil cases. He returns to Offsides to get us updated on the case. Welcome back, Austin. We appreciate your time.
Hey, absolutely. Thanks for having me on here.
An offer of $48 billion in cash, treatment, drugs, and services was rejected as lawyers for the 2,400 cities and counties involved clashed with states' attorneys general over the distribution of the settlement. So, Austin, break down for our listeners, where are we at right now?
Well, actually, as of this morning, 4 out of the 5 drug companies have actually reached a settlement. They announced this morning with some of the county reps that they've reached a settlement for some of the payments. The 5th drug company, Walgreens Boots Alliance, still has not announced an agreement, and so it's unclear as to whether the case will proceed against that lone defendant. But it seems that these pharma companies have decided they'd rather enter into a structured settlement than try to roll the dice with a federal trial over this epidemic.
So is that a move that you expected going into today? Because, I just mentioned the offer that was rejected, and, I was going to ask you why or why not should that deal have been taken. But these developments, what do they suggest to you?
It's not uncommon for us to see what I call people settling on the courthouse steps. You've got the fear of trial, the pressure of trial, the risk and reward of what could happen. And so this doesn't totally surprise me. What it communicates to me is that these drug companies are fearful for what could be handed down if they were to go to a full-blown trial over these issues. And they thought it would probably be a better choice for them to enter into a settlement that allows them to structure payments over time, maybe avoids having them have to file for any kind of bankruptcy reorganization or anything like that. And overall, just probably was a better business decision for the companies.
So, Austin, the big question that was coming into this was, hey, who's to blame for the opioid crisis? Is it the drug companies, the drug stores, the doctors, or all of the above? That's one of the big questions we've been hoping will get answered by this case. Even though it's still early, with the announcement of the settlement that you just gave to us, do the drug companies really feel like public sentiment is strongly going against them now?
I think they do. And ever since the Johnson & Johnson judgment was handed down in Oklahoma this summer, that's the question everybody's been asking, right? Is who's really responsible? Who's going to fix this problem? And me and some of my other colleagues that have been watching and following this case, I think we all agree that the problem, it's a systematic failure of the system itself. So if you look at the structure and how this plays out, you've got the pharma reps come out and they pitch these pills to these physicians, and they're usually pitching them to them in a very short window of time in between patient appointments that these doctors have, and they're not giving them the full information about the pill, whether that's intentionally or unintentionally. And so we've got a problem there on the front end that these physicians are prescribing these drugs without having the full information, without having full access to the studies behind the drugs. And so really you have to go all the way back up to the top and say that it's these big pharma companies' faults for not putting into place the information that these physicians need to try and prescribe these pills responsibly so that we avoid something like this.
So this trial is really being considered a test case for similar lawsuits from governments across the country. You just mentioned Johnson & Johnson, talked about Purdue Pharma and such. Mm-hmm. What kind of impact will this case have for those who have been affected by the opioid crisis and for future generations?
Well, and Brandon, that's a great point when you ask about those that have actually been affected by it, because all the trials we've seen so far, or the ones that have been making the biggest headlines here in Ohio and in Oklahoma, have been counties suing these companies for money to go into rehab and rehabilitation programs that they are hoping to put into place to try and fix this problem. The interesting thing is that I do believe, like your question was kind of alluding to, that this will tee up a slew of, I wouldn't call it litigation, I would call it with settlement pools and different things that will help actually compensate victims and victims' families for individuals that have been affected by the opioid crisis. And we've been saying since the summer that this has the high chance to turn into something like big tobacco in the 90s and the asbestos lawsuits in the 80s.
How do you think something like this plays out on Capitol Hill? Because you've got the instance where you have lawmakers that deal with lobbyists from these big companies. And then you have other lawmakers that are coming out right now and they're jumping on the wave of momentum against these drug companies. And they're coming out with bills that have to do with, making sure that people are not continuing to be hurt by the opioid crisis. What do you see, like I said, in how Capitol Hill, how do you think they start reacting to these lawsuits and how everything is starting to play out?
Well, Capitol Hill is going to react like they normally do, and there will be new laws passed. There will be new regulations put into place, and that's going to happen regardless. My hope is that they actually attack the real problem. What we have now is we have regulations that are coming out controlling how frequently someone can be prescribed an opioid or what duration of time they can use the opioid, how many pills they can be prescribed. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. The problem is you're trying to attack the issue at the wrong stage of the process. Mm-hmm. What we need to have, kind of like we were talking about earlier, is we need to have more regulation on the front end on how these drugs are marketed, what types of information is required to be given to the physicians and passed on to the patients, so that we can try and attack this problem on the front end and curb the problem before it becomes an epidemic.
Talking with legal analyst Austin Pennington here on Offsides. What do you think is maybe missing from this debate? Is there a point that needs to be made in all of this that's maybe getting lost in the conversation as we talk about the billions of dollars in settlement money? And we talk about some of the other things that surround the case. Is there anything that's maybe getting lost in this that really needs to have a spotlight shown on it?
The biggest thing I think that may be lost in this, and I think there's some people that understand it and some people that don't, but for the people who are asking the question, why is this such a big problem? Why is Big Pharma being held responsible? Why does everybody think this is such an epidemic? If you look at the criminal offenses that are associated with these drugs, what we've seen since this epidemic broke out is that you've got people that are using the drugs inappropriately that then lead to them developing an addiction to the pills. And then whenever they're cut off by these regulations that are there, that's when they would start to resort to self-medication through illegal drugs like methamphetamines and some of the other amphetamines that are out there. And that has created such a huge problem in our criminal defense system that was really started with these legally prescribed prescription drugs. And so I think everybody needs to understand this isn't just a problem in the doctor's offices. This is a problem that started there and has then now bled into our city streets and led to a criminal epidemic that has spread wildly as well.
Austin Pennington has been our guest. I tell you what, Austin, we always appreciate having you here with us on Offside. You always break this thing down for us so well. And this really is something that we've had great conversations about here on Offside with our listeners, talking about the opioid crisis, how it's affected them, how it's affected their loved ones. And so we really do appreciate you following this case. I know you have a passion for this case and you want to see that this comes out to the right result. And so we really appreciate you following this and giving us updates and letting us know, hey, this is what's happening. This is what it means going forward. So thank you so much, Austin.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I don't think that this is the end of it by any means. Mm-hmm. I think this is going to continue to develop, and it will probably take a number of expected and unexpected turns over the course of the next few months and maybe even years.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yes, it's huge news today, but I believe you're right. I mean, the opioid crisis, it goes so far down. I mean, it kind of feels like we're really just on the surface, just finally starting to dig in a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Austin, thank you so much once again for your time, man.
Looking forward to seeing you guys again.